Straight Talk Live.
Off. Should we get started?
Let's go. Let's crack on. It's a beautiful day in London.
It's also a beautiful day here in San Diego.
They buy things to impress people that they don't even like.
You do have to change the culture. The culture in the organization is the most important.
It's as if reality is splintering into multiple shards.
Welcome to Straight Talk Live. I am one of the co-hosts of this amazing show that's a not-for-profit. My name is Rick Snyder. I am the author of Decisive Intuition and the CEO of Invisible Edge. And this show is once again dedicated toward human, digital, and social transformation. And one of my most proud reflections of the show is we really gather top experts in the world who are on the leading edge of their field, of their craft, who are here to bring us that information and bring us that knowledge. And today is one of those exciting shows with Joseph Martinez, who will be introducing in a second. But before that, I need to introduce my amazing co-pilot, Af Malhotra. Af, take it away.
Thank you, Rick. Welcome, everyone. Yet another fantastic show that I'm so excited about. We have a very special guest on the show today who will introduce himself, and I'll tell you a little bit about the context because we always do that. I'm, of course, the co-creator of this wonderful show and this not-for-profit, and in other walks of life, I just started my foundation, involved in a lot of not-for-profit work as well as a technology entrepreneur and founder. And a lot of my change in the last 16 months since we started the show, Rick, a lot of my life shifts and paradigm shifts has happened because of this show. So this is much more than a podcast or a broadcast. It's changed our lives, and it's changed the lives of many people who listen today. So before I throw the ball over to the baseball, over to Rick, the pickleball over to Rick, I want to say something. The guest on the show today is someone I've only met twice, about a year back or so, just before the pandemic. And on both occasions, the first one was a more formal introduction, and the second one was a more relaxed luncheon, should I say. On both occasions, I gleaned a lot from my interactions with this individual. Wisdom, calm, a sense of completeness in many ways. And when I discovered his background and his life story to some extent, I was more enchanted and more hooked to this sort of a leader. And I believe when we talk about leadership on Straight Talk Live, we talk about inspirational leadership, we talk about conscious capitalism, conscious leadership, we talk about how the entire sort of structure of how leaders need to build and run teams needs to be reconsidered, reconfigured. Then I think this gentleman plays a big role in that future in whatever capacity, whatever avatar or incarnation. So the pickleball over to you, Rick. Please do the intros and let's crack on.
Okay. Thank you. And, this is going to be an exciting topic today around the future of supply chain. And we really all got to see this in the last year plus. When things break down, things break down. And so COVID completely exposed where we thought we have a seamless supply chain in so many ways around everything from medicine, medical supplies, agriculture, everything you can think about. All of a sudden, we realize how dependent we are on different nations, each other, sectors, and that don't talk to each other the way we thought they would. And they're not as synchronized and systematized. And it really exposed a lot of gaps that we have as we become more global, where that's really still fragile. And so today we're going to take a deeper look at what does that look like for the future of how we distribute goods and services, and how does AI and today's technologies play a role in that to level the playing field across the whole supply chain. And with that, we have an amazing leader, Joseph Martinez, Managing Director and Chief Procurement Officer at BNY Mellon. Joseph, welcome to Straight Talk Live.
Thank you. Very pleased to be here, Rick and Af. Thank you for inviting me. Again, I'm here representing myself today, not the bank. Happy to have a great conversation with you on the broader topic of supply chain, third-party risk management, and any other area that you may want to kind of converse relative to whether it's artificial intelligence or something as broad as art, an area that I know quite a bit about.
Okay, so let's go right there. I mean, I know even you've had a decorated military background. You've been a leader in so many different ways in all sectors you've been part of. Let's just start there. What to you makes great leadership?
I think great leadership starts with an old adage that my grandfather told me once. We have 2 ears and 1 mouth. So therefore you should be listening, not speaking, when you're trying to think through with your group what you're going to drive. And so you need to have integrity. You need to think about what is the strategic vision that you're going to put in place and allow people to actually come as their true selves. So it's really important that you look for diversity of thought as well as inclusiveness across your leadership category. And you need to make sure that you trust your folks, your team members, to be able to bring the technical expertise that they have in order to be able to drive the outcomes that you're doing on behalf of your organization. And understand that everything that you're doing, I happen to work for a bank, everything we do ultimately should be in service of our end customers with an eye towards how do we improve our earnings per share. And that can only happen if you really have a true integrated teamwork, you're driving directionally, and you're not pontificating. You're really working in there, and you should be able to do anything that you're asking your team members to do. So I think leadership starts with being a servant, setting direction, and working alongside your team.
Thank you for that. That's really profound. And I'm going to replay that back for myself in the future. I really appreciate those words. I'm curious, Joseph, how did you get into supply chain? How does one get into supply chain? It's such an interesting thing to focus on. How did that become a passion for you?
That's a great question. And it's interesting because way back when, and I've been doing this for about 30 years, nobody actually started off to go into supply chain. Today, you can actually get a PhD in supply chain from whether it's NC State under Dr. Robert Hanfield or over at Arizona State University as an example with Dr. Thomas Choi, or over in Michigan State. So formally, it has evolved into a discipline and into a profession. When I got into it, it was almost quite by accident. I had left the military, and I was looking to do something. I had relocated back to the United States, and I actually attended a diversity event. And at that diversity event, I actually met some folks that were with a community college system, and they happened to take a chance on a veteran, and they said, you know what, why don't you come in? I kind of learned how to actually do this by doing it, and learning from some really, really wise folks. I then leveraged that into a career, and then I ended up going and working for about 7 years in a consulting environment. So I became more formally trained, went and did this for major clients, both financial services and entertainment on a global basis. And then, like all good consultants, I ended up going to work for a client. And so from there, I've been working in financial services and have had really the experience of being able to work in Asia. I lived there for many years in Singapore and in Japan. In addition to that, I worked in South America, obviously in the United States, and that gave me the ability to learn how to do supply chain from a multicultural perspective, learn how to actually create truly global deals, and then that enabled me from a leadership perspective to progress up. And so this is here at Bank of New York Mellon, I am the Chief Procurement Officer, and I have been the Chief Procurement Officer at another bank. And so it's really a good culmination, but it's really around, it wasn't intentional. Along the way, I've made sure that I have lifelong learning. So I am certified through multiple certification processes in both sourcing as well as in third-party risk management. So I am one of those folks that is continually always investing in my teams and in myself in that lifelong learning journey. So that's kind of how I came to it.
Joseph, before we go into the depths of procurement and all of the other important things that come with it. Another question on leadership, which is more timely, which relates to this environment, which is more virtual now. So if you're fortunate as a leader, you've already integrated, in your words, or you created an integrated team that has a common purpose and drive, and you've got this authentic environment where people feel comfortable. That's a fortunate situation. What would you say to people or leaders who are new, who don't have that luxury and are now dealing with a virtual stroke remote team environment? Because the whole part of leadership that is just absolutely amazing is the face-to-face connectivity with your people, where you're energizing one another. The energy flows. I mean, I guess energy can flow through the video screen too. Your body language has a lot to do with it, the way you use your words and so on and so forth. How have you managed that with your team? First part of the question, and how is it different to what you've just described? And second part of the question is, what would you advise someone who hasn't got that foundation? How would they cope with this situation, in your opinion? So this is, a personal opinion.
Mm-hmm. I think I'll start by saying, when the pandemic struck, one of the very first things I did that very first week was I started what I called, at that time, it was a daily huddle. And that's where we would bring up for 15 minutes, no more, on a global basis, everybody. It doesn't matter whether you're the freshman that just got hired out of university or whether you're one of my direct reports. And we gave a forum so that everybody could have that conversation around the pandemic. So we used that to help build a sense of community, to kind of do a check-in across the globe as to what was going on. Now, as time has progressed, we've obviously shifted that because it became more of a new normal, and we do it on a weekly basis instead of a daily basis. But there at first, it was uncharted territory, and we needed to be able to do this. In addition to that, as we shifted from in-office to virtual, we needed to make sure that we were ensuring that not just our team, but our broader organization had the tools that they needed in order to be able to do this. In some parts of the world where we have large operations, having internet at home was not really something that was planned for. People came to work, that's where they had it, right? So we had to provision these folks, and we had to think about, how do we actually pivot from what we thought was a normal? How did we work to make sure that we had the appropriate security in place? How did we make sure that we had the appropriate equipment that was delivered? How did we work with our supply base to turn them into a distribution model from a logistical perspective to ensure that we were able to get the right level of connectivity, the right type of equipment, with obviously the right guidelines into the group. So that was kind of like that first foundational base. But one of the things that we've been able to do is we actually had a couple of leaders in our organization that have started during the pandemic. Mm-hmm. Never met their teams in person,
right?
But yet have highly functioning groups. Some of these are in India as an example. Some of these are in Poland as an example, where they've never met their teams, but yet they came on. We made sure that we had the right level of training. We made sure that we were giving them the right level of support. But having these interactions, and I think it's important to have skip levels so that individuals have the ability to actually know that their voice is heard. It's also important to be able to highlight it. One of the things that we did was we created what we call the CPO award, and we did it for individuals and teams because it's really important to bring up teamwork. One of the other things that we did was we had a really great session recently with your former employer, with Gartner. They did a study in terms of burnout and in terms of what you should be thinking about doing in order to ensure that your employees are not reaching that stage of burnout, so that consciously you're going in, and they gave us a series of recommendations. One of them is as simple as making sure that you're going and thanking people for the work that they're doing, recognizing and rewarding that. So I thought that was really important. But conversely, we also needed to look at our extended supply chain, because we have third and fourth parties that are delivering goods and services on behalf of the bank. And so we needed to make sure that what we were doing was we were putting in place the ability for them to be successful on our behalf but making sure that we were meeting the regulatory requirements for privacy, for the various aspects, so that operationally we would be able to think about it. Because you just can't have a bunch of non-standard practices that happen. You need to have process, you need to have controls, and you need to be able to make sure that what you're doing is looking for the truth in terms of how you're doing it. And you can do that with data. And so I can tell you honestly, in my data and analytics group, we've actually created, since the pandemic, very specific data visualization tools, dashboards, to enable people to have the transparency across their portfolios in a different lens than what we would have had we normally been inside four walls, so to speak. So I don't know if I'm answering your question directly, but I'm trying to kind of give you a flavor for what you need to do. And it comes down to culture, it comes down to role, responsibility, and ensuring that what you're putting in place is a framework that is ultimately going to give you the outcomes that you want. And it should be done from a data-driven perspective. It was once said, that which is valued is measured, that which is measured gets done. And whenever you're dealing with a supply chain, everything that you do can be measured. And therefore, you can tell how effective or efficient your program is.
Do you see this model, this massive shift of the last 16 months, which is, of course, you called it uncharted territory, and it has been that, actually. And some have done really well out of it, and you're describing some great practices that you've implemented that's worked well for your team. Do you think this has made us stronger? Do you think this has made us more resilient? Do you think this has made us more human? One of the ways I introduced you earlier on was, I didn't say human, but I felt that you had that level of authenticity and calm. And do you think that's brought that's awakened that, brought that out in a lot of people, given that we've been through a tough time? You've had to adjust, almost shapeshift in a Darwinian fashion really quickly. 6 years worth of changes happen, sometimes people say even more, in a 16-month period. Do you think we're better off now from the point of view of future leadership? Or is there a different scenario that we should be considering here?
I do think that the change driven by the pandemic has really kind of really gotten organizations to rethink what the future state is going to look and what the future of work is going to look like, right? But I also think that, in order to have lasting change, something typically has an inflection point. And I think if it's 6 months or less, you go back to the way it was. Over 6 months, you now have a shift in the paradigm, and the new normal is kind of the way it's going to work. So I think one of the big things that has changed is the mindset from a management perspective relative to hybrid working. Right. There are many large organizations that initially said you have to be in the office 5 days a week, 8 to whatever, and I think that mindset has changed, and I think it's changing because they're seeing that the productivity has actually increased. Okay, and part of that is because if you're in the East Coast, what happens is you have a lengthy commute if you're living in Connecticut or in Jersey, et cetera, trying to get into New York City, as an example. So when the pandemic hit, you saw that people would always start meetings at about 8:15 or later. Now they're starting them at 7 o'clock sometimes. Okay, because they're taking advantage of the fact that there was no longer the need for that commute. Now, again, there's pros and cons to that. But I also think that you're starting to see the humanity of individuals relative to that work-life balance. Because in some instances, you'll see children walking in the back or you'll have, pets. I was in a conference recently where a cat came in and the speaker just was like freaking out because a cat came into their house. But you know what? That's normal now. Okay, and so it gets you to start to think differently as a group. And it allows you to actually be, I think, a bit more creative because now you're able to bring more ideas to the table. And, Zoom, as an example, is a great equalizer. Everybody has a voice, and it's really how do you actually want to express that voice. And so I do think that there are changes there, but there's also changes in the way we have the relationships that we have with our customers and that we have with our suppliers. Those I know have significantly changed because of the way we had to do this. Think about this. If I used to work for one of the big four years ago, we always felt that the only way we could deliver a consulting engagement was to physically be on site with the client.
Right.
So they you could interact, you could whiteboard, etc. But if you go and you talk to many of these folks, because a lot of these partners are people that I've worked with for 30 years, right? They have found that you can actually deliver the value, the intellectual capital, virtually without having to be in the room with your client, and therefore you're giving a better product at a reduced cost, and part of that cost is eliminating the travel. You're not doing a Monday Thursday flight to get from point A to point B. And so that's starting to get people to rethink what the art of the possible is relative to what that experience is going to be with your suppliers. Okay, so that level of trust goes up. And I think, the amount of data that's been created during this pandemic that is going to be mined for years, I think is just really, really important. And it gives us an opportunity to really see what kind of insights that we can drive from this. What can we actually do to actually change the way our cost base are in terms of the way our suppliers are delivering value to us, and how does that ultimately help us to be more efficient, effective, and how do we actually change the mindset of our employees? I'll give you a tangible example. In my group, I had people go through 12-week certification programs virtually. Okay, and so they were able to upskill themselves with something that they can take with them no matter where they go. And that showed that we had an investment in them as people. So I think it's really important that we don't lose the opportunity that the pandemic has given us to rethink how work will be, to think how our customer interactions are going to be, and to think what the strategies are that we need to do to drive innovation. Because there's a lot of innovation that has occurred, not just within supply chain, but across businesses during this pandemic. So I'll stop there and let's, I don't want it to be a diatribe. I'd rather it be a conversation.
No, Joseph, I love these points. I want to get to the heart of supply chain. So let's go here right
Absolutely.
now. And I'd love to discuss the mindset and the technologies. So let's start with mindset first. When I think of procurement, traditionally, I would think when you're hired to make the most profit you can for your business and to look at cutting costs and have advantage for yourself. But in our conversations prior, you've talked about actually your paradigm is more how do we find a win-win scenario for all stakeholders? And that doesn't seem the usual conversation I hear from procurement leaders out there in the space. So I'd love to hear more about this paradigm. You mentioned paradigm shift. How do you see this paradigm shift? Talk more about the mindset of that, and why would that even be a benefit for people in procurement?
Well, I think the mindset is that, we need to build a culture of leaders with our frontline employees and our suppliers that are really going to allow us to be able to change what we're doing. And it used to be, if you think about the levels of maturity, right? The lowest level of maturity is really just going up and trying to squeeze cost. We're not haggling. That was 1950s. That was the green eye shade period. Okay, what we're doing now is we're actually business leaders that are helping to look at how we're going to drive it. And believe it or not, if you're in a highly regulated industry like I am, risk actually has kind of over the last maybe 5-10 years has really become the leading concern with the regulators, the third-party risk management. How are you managing the risks associated with your supply chain? And how are you making sure that your suppliers aren't going to fail? And so you have to tier your suppliers. You have to go in there and you have to figure out how do you get a better performance out of them, so that you're not just looking at them in terms of transactions. You're looking at them more holistically across the spectrum. Okay, and what you need to do is you need to be able to make sure that you're helping to transcend the old idiom of essentially, I pay you, you do for me, let's move on. That's not what this is about. It's really how are you going to define value? How is that value going to be mutual? And, you know, I actually want my suppliers to make as much profit as they possibly can if they're delivering to me the value that I need that is ultimately going to enable me to actually improve my stock price, right? You know, so I have to think about, you know, what are the expected benefits that I can get from that kind of a relationship? And that comes down to actually understanding how do we actually integrate our processes? How do we integrate the value exchange that is going between us? And how do we shift the mindset? I mean, if you think back 10 years ago, if you were doing an application development initiative, you were thinking about it in terms of a waterfall and milestone deliverables. Now we think about it in terms of agile, right? And so that makes us, from a procurement perspective, also have to really rethink how we're doing our contracting. Because now you're talking about story points, you're talking about backlog, you're talking, the whole mindset has shifted. And so that makes you have to have a better relationship, which means that you need to actually understand the risk associated with whoever you're going to go through these partnerships on. Okay, think about it. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there really wasn't cloud. Cloud was more of an idea. Today, massive amounts of transactions are happening on public and private clouds. That changes again the risk profile of what activities that you're doing, which means that it has to shift how you are approaching those relationships from a procurement perspective. Okay, and so if you really think about it, 10 years ago, we did stuff on Excel, right? And we did what I would call very high-level business cases. Today, we're using artificial intelligence to help us make better decisions, so that we can actually take huge amounts of disparate information across our supply chain and across our suppliers, and use that to make sure that we're looking at our financial viability, make sure that we're looking at our risk, making sure that whatever program or process we're putting in place is actually going to drive the outcome that is going to give us the result that we're looking for without a win-lose. Because it's not going to do me any good not to be not to have a relationship with a third party that is, these guys we've squeezed them so hard they can't be profitable. That will translate into reduced service levels. That will translate into missed opportunity, and ultimately, you're not going to be a customer of choice for them. And you want to be the customer of choice because that's where they'll come to you with innovation. That's where they'll come to you with partnership, and that's which will allow us to be much more effective in terms of the outcome that we're driving, right? Because from a procurement perspective, I have to think about price times quantity. Okay, the price is, and the squeezing of price, that's 15 years ago. The quantity or the demand management, that requires you to have the disparate information sets so you can do the forecasting. Okay, you can't forecast unless you have large amounts of data, and so you need to be, you need to have the processes in place that are going to be able to give you data-driven results, which are essentially going to allow you to drive from an outcome perspective. How do you forecast? How do you improve accuracy in terms of what you're doing across your supply chain? How do you actually, secure stakeholder buy-in for everything that you're doing so that they understand that you have their best interests at heart, right? And so we're one of the fields that generates a lot of data, and so it's really important for us to think about how do we actually use, statistical modeling techniques within a supply chain in order to be able to manage our cost base, our risk base, and ultimately the end client experience.
You talked about, I want to touch on one point because you mentioned AI while you were describing what you were a second ago, and then you talked about data and analytics. Talk us through specifics, if you would, on either a live example or something you can share with us, which brings it to life for some of our listeners. How does someone in supply chain or in procurement use artificial intelligence to do what you've described? Just give us a couple of examples.
Okay, I'll give you one. I'll start with an example in terms of contract lifecycle management. Okay. So that is an evolving field where they're using both machine learning and artificial intelligence. And so historically, managing a supplier post-contract was somewhat difficult because because people didn't have the ability. They did quantitative rather than qualitative scorecarding. Okay, and so with the rise of some of these contract lifecycle management tools, where you can decompose into the metadata and you can actually extract all of the obligations and you can track them, that will give you the ability to then be able to go in and actually hold each other accountable, so that you can actually understand what you're doing. I've done this. I've done this at several companies, and in doing so, have recouped tens of millions of hard dollars, where you go in and you find out that, guess what, we didn't take advantage of a discount at a certain amount of time, or if we took a look at what was actually happening, if it was a time and materials event, as an example, there could be a possibility that your supplier has the same individual on 3 engagements at the same time. Mm-hmm. Don't laugh, that's happened. Okay, and so using the data that's available to you and the ability to go through with the 360 type of view, that gives you that insight. So contract management is evolving, and the use of AI and ML in both the authoring as well as the obligations management, that is frontline. That is something that is happening today, and that is something that is evolving, which I think is ultimately going to strengthen the supply chain, and
right.
We can hold each other accountable. So that's just one example. I think another example that comes to mind is in spend management, right? Because if you take a look across most global organizations who are going across 50, 100 different companies, what you find with them is that they can't actually have the transparency of what they're actually buying holistically. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of multiple disparate data points, but once you can actually get that in there, you can then normalize it with a taxonomy. Once you have a normalized taxonomy, you can then start to do category management. That category management can then allow you to then put the right level, so that you can push into what I call buying channels, mm-hmm. the appropriate action for what you're going to do. If it's something that is repeatable, it's generic, guess what? You put that in a catalog. Okay, and now you have the ability to go out and build pricing around that catalog. Mm-hmm. If it's something that's professional services related, I think I was one of the first guys in the industry that actually used what's called a reverse auction to actually normalize and figure out what the rate should be, whether it's for a managed service or whether it's for time and materials. So again, it's really about how do you actually think about the data points that you can gather. How can you utilize those data points through models to be able to run simulations to figure out what the right outcome is going to be relative to price, relative to risk, relative to contracting, and relative to ongoing monitoring of those third-party relationships.
Fantastic. How does this affect? Sorry, one point. Thinking devil's advocacy here. How does this, what you're describing, imagine you're the clients in this case, and you've done all of these wonderful things with technology, and it's making you better, faster, more efficient, agile, and so on. How do the vendors respond to this? How do the people who are trying to sell into the big institutions, organizations deal with this? Let me make it a little bit more difficult. Let me talk about not a massive, huge, large organization like a big vendor. I won't name any, but let's talk about a younger startup-ish, scale-up-ish type company that is trading or trying to transact with a big company. How do they fit into this puzzle, given innovation is the central theme for the next gen of supply chain as well?
Well, when you think about it, younger, smaller companies are obviously more agile and have the ability to, I think, actually disrupt longer or longer term industries, right? And so I think ensuring that you are plugged into the innovation labs that a company might have, mm-hmm. I think is really crucial. And then taking a look at how do you actually contract with them. You have to look at them a little bit differently, almost like you have to incubate them in order to be able to give them the opportunity to be able to come in. Because they may not have the requisite requirements that you may have from an insurance perspective, or if it's a startup, they may not have 5 years of financials because they weren't around except for 18 months ago. the technology that they're bringing in, I think is important for you to really think through, what is really your organization's needs, what is the minimal viable information that you need, and if you put them through some sort of an incubator program, that will also help us, because we're looking for things that are going to help us to disrupt our competitors, right? And so you're not going to do that internally. That's typically going to be with a startup somewhere. And so by investing in them, by literally taking warrant stocks in them, or actually going into their Series A, those are all things I think that help us to kind of drive that. But you need to be intellectually curious and kind of rigor test them. So when you think about this, one of the highest costs in financial services is call centers.
Right.
And getting the information from a call center is very, very latent with human beings. Okay, I call them carbon-based life forms, right? And carbon-based life forms are interesting, okay, because I think people like to interact with people. However, they cannot as quickly disseminate information that's needed. And so there are emerging companies out there that I've seen, okay, that have the ability to essentially integrate using artificial intelligence, voice, text, multi-disparate ways of communicating, which reduce the cycle time, give a better answer more effectively. But if we were to go and try and contract with some of these companies, they've been around for 2 years maybe, right? Mm-hmm. They don't have the ability to, if our programs are so rigid that we say, well, unless you have 3 years of audited financials, we can't even talk to you. Unless you sign up to our requirements from our master agreements, I don't ever want somebody just to sign the master agreement, because that tells me that they don't understand the risks that they're taking on. So it's about how do you actually use the right tool for the job. Think about it like this is very analog. Think about the old tool belts, and you had the saw, you had the measure, or whatever, right? Again, I'm going to quote my grandfather. He used to say, "To the man who only has a hammer, every problem is a nail." Okay, and so I'm articulating to you, we have to have different tools as we look at different types of the supply chain, and we have to understand how does this ultimately tie into our long-term strategy for growth. Okay, and as you may have recently seen, several financial services companies are starting to invest in cryptocurrencies. That was something that 2 years ago they would have never done.
Right.
So it's about taking a risk. It's about having leadership that understands, what are you going to do, and understand that there's going to be an investment and there's going to be risk with that investment as you're trying to bring some of these younger organizations into the fold. But some of these will ultimately help you, again, do what we want is to ensure that we are efficient, effective, and driving to earnings per share.
Yeah. One point I want to dive into with this, part of my field of study is studying intuitive intelligence and some of the science behind how that works with our different neural pathways internally as human beings, but also how that interacts with AI is pretty fascinating, because AI is mimicking, and it's a mirror of us, right? It's almost our child, you could say, in some ways. And so my question to you, something that we talked about before, Joseph, is around negotiation. And you're seeing how AI is getting better and better at negotiating itself with some of the technologies around reading body mechanics and facial expression and micro expressions, tone, all these things. Can you talk a little bit more about what are you seeing in terms of the power of AI, in terms of its ability to negotiate? How close is it to human and salespeople and what we have today? How far away is it? What are you seeing on the cutting edge?
I've seen some things with some of the large technology companies that are investing heavily in this, right? And I still think that we're in a nascent period, and I haven't experienced it, but I did read about what happened when one of the big, and I won't name them, one of the big tech companies actually created a negotiating bot, and after they actually turned it off, because after a number of iterations, what happened was the bot started to lie. And started to game. You can Google it. I won't name who it is, but It's somebody out of California. You'll be able to figure this out. But I still think that at the end of the day, it's really about how do you actually get the diagnostic information that you need in order to be able to drive that. I still think that we're a ways from using machine-to-machine negotiation. I still think that we're probably at least 10 years away from that. Where we get there, I think we will. I think where we can use the tools more effectively is in terms of the way we actually go to market. Okay, and so whether that be something like a reverse auction or a Japanese auction, or some other area where you're either trying to understand what the market is so you can drive price down, or if you're trying to come to an outcome solution, how you can actually shorten that cycle time between offer and acceptance. And there's a lot of nuance that goes into that. So I think there's a lot of investment that's going into this. I think that for direct materials, I think that's really where the groundbreaking negotiation will happen, because it's a more defined area. In the indirect space, where you're really doing more like services, I'm not so sure that is going to be something that is going to be as impactful in a short period of time. Okay, because I still think that it's more of that human interaction. You need to get that spend view. You need to be able to look at the data. You need to be able to get the points. But I think that on the indirect side of the procurement spectrum, I don't see that as being the leader relative to getting this types of negotiations. I do think that we'll see that much sooner on the direct side, just based on the finite variables that can go into a negotiation if you're going to build silicon chips, as an example, versus developing a piece of software. I think there are polar ends of the spectrum, of the continuum that you can do that. So I do think it'll help us as we are doing our strategic planning. I think it's going to help us to move away from tactical to a more effective, and I think it will be a disruption within the negotiation process. But I think for right now, it's really how do you get the sourcing insights? How do you get the cost optimization strategies? How do you prepare for the negotiation? Not necessarily how do you do the negotiation at that point.
Right. Talking about negotiation, and I want to touch on the points around talent. So with so much change going on and people needing to learn new things, skills changing, there's a lot of development that's required at every level, leadership down. So talk us through what you're seeing in your organization or outside around how the needs and the dynamics related to talent is changing. And I'm doing the devil's advocate piece. The general perception, and it might be different now, is that someone from procurement is trained to do X, Y, and Z things around vendor management, vendor negotiation, vendor consolidation, everything to do with the suppliers. And a few things have happened over the last couple of years where the role of every executive has become way more prominent, because the CEO said, listen, how do I deal? So much change is going on uncharted waters. How do I deal with this CPO? I've never seen this before. Supply chains are being disrupted. Political situations are making it absolutely, troublesome or painful to really predict what's going to happen with a lot of our suppliers and so on and so forth. So all of this change is happening. It's confusing. There's a lot of uncertainty. Tell us a little bit more about, you can give an example of your team as well, but what does the talent dynamic situation look like? Do we see procurement people changing? Are their skill sets and their traits going to change? When I was back in my corporate role, even for my company, we talk about hiring on traits, training for skills. Hiring on traits, training for skills. Skills can be, anyone can learn skills, but traits are very, very hard to find. That hunger, that desire, the curiosity, so on and so forth. Talk us through that, and what's your philosophy around that?
Well, I think I'll start with answering, do I see the profession changing? The answer that is absolutely, because I think there are some foundational gaps that are currently existing. Yeah. But if you go in, and I have conversations with multiple universities, in terms of, they come to me and they've asked, what do you want us to train in, right? And I think, If you had asked me that 15 years ago, we would have probably said negotiation. That's not what we're saying today. Today we're saying they need to have a data science foundation. And you're like, well, why does somebody in supply chain need to have a data science foundation? I'm telling you, that is now part of the core curriculum in many of the universities, because they understand and appreciate the fact that if they don't understand how to actually work with the data and actually basically be data scientists first, it's going to be very difficult for them to be able to make that leap into what's going on in the future, right? And so when I think about these things, I think leaders are really taking a look at the foundational gap analysis that we have in the industry, okay? And one of the things that we know is that we need to be teaching people data science. Mm-hmm. That is becoming so crucial to what we do. And if you take a look at a lot of the larger global procurement organizations, they will have actual data scientists that are in there, because we know that is so foundational to what we're trying to do. And we're trying to change the mindset from people that are really, our profession has really been dominated with a value preservation mindset, right? So we're out there thinking about how are we going to avert, adverse effects of the pandemic, or how are we going, and we've got to change that so we have more of a forward-looking view, so that we're able to kind of, embrace our role as value creators and partner with the enterprise, partner with the C-suites in order for us to be able to drive, the outcome that we need to do, which is essentially how do we make more profit, less risk, at a better cost for our organizations. And to do that, you have to change what is being taught in university. You have to be able to have an impact in terms of what you're training internally, because I believe that you have to have a lifelong learning process within your organizations and with you in yourselves as individuals, right? So if you need to give people stretch assignments, you need to be able to get people to rotate. And I honestly believe that you should be, within the large organizations, you should be rotating people every 2 to 3 years into different activities, because that's what's going to round them out and what is ultimately going to help us to increase the value of what we're doing. I'll give you an example. Many years ago, I worked for Bank of America. And at Bank of America, every 2 to 3 years, we were seeding people into different parts of the business. And if you go back, we made sure that people got trained in Six Sigma back then, and we made sure that we were rotating them into operations, into finance, into different areas. And if you go back there today, a lot of these folks have risen up into different areas. I was recently talking to one who's an executive vice president of human resources, but 15 years ago, this guy was in sourcing. So it's a matter of how do you actually ensure that you're putting in place a mindset that your birth certificate did not say you were a purchasing person. It said that you were a human being, and you've got to foster creativity. I'm going to show you. I'm an artist. I don't know if you can see this or not.
Oh yeah, that's cool.
Beautiful.
So one of the things that I do is I try and utilize my art to be able to help me center myself and to think more creatively. In this case, it's a frog coming out, evolving out of an orange, right? A little surrealistic, but what it does is it allows you to be rethinking, because you've got to get people to bring their whole self, their authentic self, to what they're doing, so that you can do this. Because all of the investment in AI is not going to do you any good if you have people that don't know how to think.
Right.
Bang on. Now we know why we're talking to you, because you're really an artist. You've tapped into our creative. I'm a musician, and there is I think there is an X factor in the brain when you have these other skill sets. You can read situations very, very differently. But that's amazing. Rick, you were going to ask something. I know we're running short on time. We have a question.
Yeah, let's bring in some questions from audience, and also a reminder out there, if you're watching live, please type in your questions now for Joseph so we can get them to him. So Joseph, here's a question from Facebook. How exactly does AI help us avoid the problems we experienced with our supply chains during the pandemic? So if we can get a little more specific, how does AI actually help us avoid the problems that are coming forward?
Well, I think what it does is it allows you to link your data to your sourcing insights. And then you can develop what I call category strategies that enable you to then kind of think through how you're actually going to do this. So I'm trying to kind of think of a succinct example of where this helps us. It has helped us in essentially looking at how we actually interact on and how we actually move transactions on a global basis. Okay, and where we can optimize how we're actually driving that. Okay, so it basically helps us to kind of differentiate how we're actually approaching our problems and how we're actually ensuring that we're providing the right information at the right time, which ultimately results into the right good, into the right place. Okay, again, we do nothing but indirect. We don't build anything as a bank.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
But what we do is we distribute this. Okay?
Ooh, I want some of those.
And so yeah, and so it's important that we think about, you know, what are we doing so that we're, you know, incorporating into our process ways to become more efficient and effective. You know, if you had asked anybody pre-pandemic whether or not they actually wanted to really think about using, you know, tokenization of payments so that you're able to actually do the distribution in fractional components to a larger audience, people would have thought that was insane. But I'll tell you what, people are now thinking about that because while we may want these, you don't want the physical ones. During a pandemic, you don't want to be touching this. Okay, I've held on to this for already like a year and a half, right? Because nobody wants to take this because of the germs or the potential opportunity. So that's why digital currency is now becoming so important. Okay, and so our ability to help to put in place agreements with these types of providers in order to be able to enable the digitization of the supply chain and the payment cycle, that's really important. You know, this is important, but if I can do this as a fraction of a digital currency, as I'm doing a settlement with a supplier, and that supplier is in turn doing a settlement with their suppliers, that makes a much more efficient and robust ecosystem where you're not having to physically transport this anywhere. And it's a lot more secure, and it also, as you can tell, it derives some greater value. I'm not sure I gave you a good example, but it's one that I know that is real and is happening.
You know, it brings up a question that's been on a lot of our minds recently with the huge wave around crypto and the excitement around crypto. And as you said earlier on the show, you know, a lot of the institutions that would maybe look down on it are now investing in it, whether JP Morgan's, Chase's, Goldman Sachs, et cetera. What do you think is the future of crypto? What are you seeing in the space?
I think, well, first off, I think that, and again, I'm speaking as a person, not as a representative of any institution. I think with acceptance is going to come regulation. Okay, and you know, I have to think immediately back to some of the ransomware attacks that have recently happened. Okay, and those ransomware attacks, they were essentially using cryptocurrency as a form of paying the ransom. And something that 5 years ago they said was impossible, which is to basically break into a digital wallet. We've proven that is now possible, and we've seen that with the retrieval of a couple of $1 million of the ransom that was paid for the oil pipeline, right? It's public news. So I think that it's going to become, you know, very, very pertinent. I'll give you an example. Several years ago, I used to work for a Japanese bank. This Japanese bank created a cryptocurrency that could actually be used on your digital wallet. And at that time, they were looking to have it rolled out for what was supposed to be the Olympics in 2020, which I think are going to happen this summer, because it was going to be a way to help people with an exchange process without having to actually carry any of this stuff as they go through from an Olympic perspective, right? I don't know if they're going to be able to do this, but part of this was with what they were doing with Coinbase, right? And so I do believe that it is becoming a normalized process, but I do think that the regulatory component is going to be there, and with that, the taxation component. So I think we're going to see changes in that, but I think it's going to become very, very common. I envision that my younger son, that he'll buy a house using crypto at some point. You know, I think it's just going to become another medium. The way when I was a child, and I'm an old man, credit cards were just coming out, right? So it was, but today nobody even thinks about that. Debit cards then evolved. This is just another evolution in a financial transaction capability. You know, paper money evolved because people didn't want to carry around bricks of gold, right? So, so this is just an evolution, I think, and I think with the security and the ability to make the payments through a secure manner. I honestly think that this is here to stay. I think we will see leaps in terms of the creation of the types of use from a cryptocurrency perspective, and you know, I'm all in on that. I believe it's the right way to go.
Wonderful. I mean, there is the possibilities are definitely infinite. I guess at some point we're going to see large enterprises use some form of a coin to pay their vendors, and you know, that's.
I can tell you some already are.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, we're hopeful because we believe in change, and I think things need to evolve and be displaced sometimes for that change to come through. So, are there any more questions, Rick, that have come through?
Looks like that's all I see right now, unless Denise has any back there.
Okay.
So
I have one final one. It's not a big question; it's more a personal one. For those, for you know, we have a group called the Maverick Leaders Group, Joseph, that is a combination of a lot of our past speakers and existing outliers, nonconformists, mavericks, whatever you want to call them, and aspiring mavericks, outliers, nonconformists. What would you say about the next 10 years to those folks out there? What words of wisdom would you say before you close off this call to make us feel more hopeful and inspired and excited about what's to come tomorrow?
I think to be intellectually curious at all times. I think to be diverse in terms of your interests, because I think that all of those are going to help us to kind of drive things forward. And I also think that it's really important for us to think about this from a global perspective, because too often we're looking at it from whatever country we're coming from. And if we're going to be successful, we need to think about this much more holistically. And we need to embrace the insight that we can gather. I mean, think about prior to virtual assistants. Now people don't even think twice about talking to their phone, to gather information, or to listen to music or to monitor their health. So I think embracing this, don't be afraid of it. Promote value-added services that are going to be, evolving through this process. And I think that people need to think about becoming entrepreneurs. I think that historically it's 35 and younger, which is really where the entrepreneurial spirit is. I think that we now live in an age, just based on the sophistication of algorithms that are out there, that individuals should have the mindset at any age to be able to go out there and create value for themselves and for society in general, and to do it in an ethical manner. Do it, just out of intellectual curiosity, not because you want to make money. That happens to be a byproduct of it,
right?
Because you want to deliver alternative value across various ecosystems.
That's nicely summed up. That's beautiful. Ethics, intellectual curiosity. We will absolutely have that as a hashtag, and heck, that's why we set this up, because of the intellectual curiosity that we had to ensure that we're not ill-prepared again for the next pandemic. So Thank you so much, Joseph. It's been an absolute pleasure listening to your stories and your experiences. And we're certainly more hopeful about the future that's to come. And it's great to see that procurement and all of the bias and perception that some people may have who are not in that field will see it totally transform based on what you're telling us. Roles change, and procurement people will be data scientists too. So more jobs for data scientists. Which is great. Rick, I'll hand it over to you to close the proceedings and talk about next week as well.
Yeah, just want to say thank you again, Joseph, for everything that you brought today. Very inspired, and looking forward to more engagement with you in our community as well. And where can people find out more about you and your good work? Where should they go?
I guess LinkedIn would probably be I do not. I'll sound like a heretic. I don't do Facebook.
So LinkedIn is the best place to look for what you're up to nowadays and what have you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So go to LinkedIn, look for Joseph Martinez there. And thank you again for being on Straight Talk Live. And next week, you're welcome. And next week, we're going to be actually talking about data privacy a little more deeply, which is something we touched on today. We're going to have back Anurag Lal, the CEO of NetSphere, and used to be in the Obama administration at one point, and an incredible wealth of knowledge in terms of data privacy, what's going on in the space, and Section 230, which was enacted back in '96 around giving protections from liability to some of the big companies that we know of today that might be infringing on our data. Let's talk more on Straight Talk Live about what's really going on and what needs to change in terms of our data privacy and getting some sovereignty back. So thank you all, Straight Talkers out there. Keep straight talking with those in your lives, and be well. Have a great rest of your week. Over and out.
Thank you, guys. All the best.